Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to UCSF Family and Community Medicine Grand Rounds. We have a fantastic and very special session today in store for you. But before we go ahead, I want to just make a few general announcements. The first one that you've probably noticed is that this session is being recorded. I also want to say a special thanks, as always, to our tech team, to Roy Johnston, Benjamin Wallen, Arago Mitchell, and also to Nora Franco today for joining us for assistance with our webinar. If you missed part of today's session or you want to go back and see any other sessions, you can find us on the UCSF Family and Community website. All prior sessions are recorded and uploaded, as today's will be too. We encourage you to share your suggestions with us. If you have suggestions for today's speakers or for previous speakers, we'll put an evaluation into the chat for you to fill out sometime during the session. Also, if you have suggestions for other Grand Round speakers, please get in touch with Roy or I. We'd love to hear your suggestions because we're always looking for dynamic and engaging speakers on topics related to health equity, family medicine, social justice, and advocacy. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. As folks trickle in, the title of our talk today is Safety for All and Care Without Criminalization, a DPH Must Divest Intro to Patients' Rights. Over the past 2 years, DPH Must Divest has organized at SFDPH to abolish contracts with the San Francisco Sheriff's Department, building on non-policing crisis responses and to transform the culture of our hospitals and clinics. SFDPH is the violent minority, as one of the less than 1% of systems nationwide dependent on law enforcement alone to provide security. We know that policing in the hospital is a racial justice issue, with 70% of the use of force incidents being against Black patients and visitors in the ED in 2019, despite representing only 24% of the patient population. In today's Grand Rounds presentation, our speakers will give a framework for thinking about abolition and the history of our campaign to get the sheriffs out of our hospitals and clinics. They will then introduce Know Your Rights materials regarding policing in the hospital, presented by a law professor and law school graduate, and ground those protections in a conversation between two family medicine residents. Finally, they will offer further resources to interrupt criminalization and get involved in our campaign. We have a terrific list of presenters today. They're going to tell you more about themselves, but just so you know who you'll be meeting, our presenters are Professor Ana Delgado, who is a clinical professor in the Department of OBGYN, Professor Ji-Sun Song, who is a professor of law, Dr. Anita Bajwa, who's a UCSF family medicine resident, Norman Archer, who is a third-year UCSF medical student, Jake Sonnenberg, who's a third-year medical student at UCSF and also holds a law degree, and Dr. Kelly Butler, who is a UCSF family medicine resident. So I'm excited to welcome everybody today. And again, as a reminder for folks who just joined, please ask questions and share your comments using the Q&A section that you see on your screen. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Margot. We're really excited to be here today with all of you. My name is Norman Archer, and I'm a third-year medical student here at UCSF and a member of DPH Must Divest. And I'm really excited to be here today with some of my friends and colleagues to present this presentation. As Margot mentioned, DPH Must Divest is the coalition of healthcare workers, healthcare students, and community members that seek to remove the San Francisco Sheriff's Department from the city's Department of Public Health, clinics, and San Francisco General Hospital. We aim to reinvest the divested funds in our community and systems that are committed to trauma-informed care, de-escalation, and community accountability. In this Grand Rounds presentation today, we're going to provide a framework for thinking about abolition and talk about how policing and criminalization manifest in our hospital system. We'll learn from two legal experts who will introduce some Know Your Rights materials before grounding that practice in a conversation between two family medicine residents. Finally, we're going to offer some resources to interrupt criminalization and get involved with our campaign. So let's begin. Many, if not all of you, have heard the term abolish the police or defund the police in the past few years. When it comes to abolition, I would like you to take a second to think about where you first heard of the term and how you would define it. I would also encourage you to think about What emotions or thoughts come up when you think about abolition? For me, the first time I heard the word abolition was when I learned about the history of slavery in the United States. Slavery was a racist, violent, but entirely legal and formal institution in the United States, and the abolition of slavery required not only a massive political mobilization, but also a fundamental change in ideology. The origins and legacy of abolition are rooted in justice and equality. History also shows us that the systems of law enforcement in the United States were derived from slave patrols, where gangs caught and punished enslaved people who sought freedom, and that policing is rooted in the protection of the property of the wealthy and the suppression of workers' rights. From the enforcement of the Black codes to the Jim Crow laws, to the war on drugs and the Black Lives Matter movement, it's clear that the police were created to and continue to oppress communities. Here, in our own city of San Francisco, the SF Sheriff's Department was created in 1850, and the first sheriff was chosen for his reputation for the slaying of Indigenous and Mexican people. The origin and the legacy of policing is violence, and the system of policing continues to cause harm. With this context in mind, let's continue with defining abolition. Broadly speaking, abolition can be defined as the act of formally ending a system, practice, or institution. So in the context of policing and the carceral system, one way to define abolition is a world in which we don't have prisons or police. For many people, their reaction to this definition is to conjure up a world without law or order that might feel dangerous or unsafe. And while I would argue that the world is dangerous and unsafe with and because of these institutions, I also understand why people imagine abolition in this way. So let's think about an alternative definition or way of thinking about abolition. Instead of thinking about abolition as a world in which we don't need police or prisons, or don't have police or prisons, let's think about abolition as a world in which we don't need police or prisons. Think about what we could build if we divest from these systems and imagine new ways of safety for our communities. As the prison abolitionist and scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore states, abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And there are so many ways to define abolition and to think about abolition. And I would really encourage everyone to check out the work of these scholars and their quotes here and their work and others to learn about the history of abolition and to learn about the current work being done to put it into action. For many people, these ideas sound great, but they also might sound unrealistic or unattainable. And to that, I would say two things. The first is to remember our history, to remember that the legal institutions like slavery have been abolished. Remember that the rights of all marginalized people that we have today only exist because of massive political mobilization. And two, I would say to start small. Start with what you can control in your day-to-day life and in your work. That's where this presentation comes in, to discuss the specific ways in which healthcare intersects with policing and provide concrete actions that we can take to interrupt criminalization of our patients and communities. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Ana Delgado.
Thank you so much, Norman. My name is Ana. I'm a midwife. I work in the Family Birth Center, and I'm really excited to be with you all today. So given this very harmful history and oppressive purpose of the carceral system that Norman just shared, we should be doing everything possible to not contribute to the criminalization of our patients and community members. However, we all know that this is unfortunately not true. What ways do you see us contributing to the criminalization of our patients? Or how do we overexpose our patients to the carceral system? I'm going to give you an example to sort of get your creative juices flowing, but one example would be how we document the evaluation and management of patients who are either having a miscarriage or self-managed abortion in areas where abortion is illegal. If we document that the patient may be experiencing an abortion, we may as well have called the police ourselves in these settings. I think it is important for all of us to keep in mind how we are participating. Last night at an abolition event put on by Interrupting Criminalization, Dr. Jamila Parrott quoted that most people who are reported to law enforcement for illegal abortion, quote unquote, were reported by their healthcare providers. So take a moment to think about that and think about how you personally contribute to that entanglement. Next slide. So this is a big ask. How do we do this? How do we start to pull apart these systems that are very, unfortunately, very integrated? How do we sever the connections between healthcare and the carceral system? So beyond do no harm, which is a set of principles, a framework, is a really helpful abolitionist framework for healthcare providers. It's really important for us to stay grounded in frameworks like this, because this type of work is different from anything we've ever done before. None of us were trained to do this unless we specifically sought out this training. So without this type of grounding, it is really easy to lose your way and to think that you're acting in patients' best interest when in fact we're exposing them to criminalization. And we'll say more about this framework later on. Next slide, please. Although some of you may be listening in from other institutions, thanks for being here. We're going to contextualize this conversation here on our campus at San Francisco General. And while some of the examples refer specifically to the Sheriff's Department or the Police Department, we would like to note that other departments such as UCPD, Officers from Juvenile Detention, CHP, et cetera, also harm our patients. The use of force data that I'm going to present here reflects incidents involving the Sheriff's Department, and this data is not unique to San Francisco General. This is the natural consequence of what happens when you place law enforcement with the legacy and history that Norman shared in close proximity to people of color, particularly Black and African American people. So this is not a unique situation. It is actually a natural expected consequence of having law enforcement so close to our patients. So DPH spends $20 million annually on funding the SF Sheriff's Department to provide security. I think a lot of us could find ways to use that money that would actually support healing for our patients. And as Margot shared in the intro, less than 1% of hospitals nationwide depend on law enforcement alone for security. So we're really outliers. And in this graph, and I apologize if it's a little bit small, but basically that cluster of bars on the left shows that most use of force incidents in the last fiscal year were due to fighting. And fighting is an issue that is particularly amenable to prevention and de-escalation. So there's so many opportunities here to protect our patients. Next slide. Furthermore, this use of force is disproportionately used on Black and African American people, which is the orange line at the top of that graph. Black and African American people make up 53% of the people experiencing use of force, while only making up 22% of our patient population. And in the ED specifically, as Margot said in the introduction, this disparity is even starker, with African Americans making up 70% of the use of force incidents, while only comprising 24% of the visits. And despite this glaring disparity, the de-escalation training that we all took this year, for example, those of you who work here just finished your annual learning, for the most part, we all did it, makes no mention of racism as a factor in escalations, and does not call on us as staff to examine our own racial bias as part of our learning on how to de-escalate situations, and as clinical staff to avoid calling law enforcement, because let's be clear, it's clinical staff that are involving the sheriff in most of these situations. This change in the current curriculum would be a small example of actions we can take now to start addressing this problem. Next slide, please. So we also have data from the community. So our community has provided us many, many other examples. We have a survey with 152 respondents that provides us data that is not sort of filtered through the eyes of our security department or the sheriff's department's own data. And there's so many ways in which people have witnessed law enforcement harming our patients, including things like chokeholds, the use of restraints on labor and delivery, and other things. So we know that this is a problem from many different angles. And like I said, this is not unique to our hospital. This is the natural consequence of having law enforcement in close proximity to our patients. And that's why this is why we are abolitionists, and we need to continue to limit both our involvement and also the mere presence of law enforcement on our campus. So with that, I'd like to transition to Ji-sun and Jake to continue the conversation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ji-sun Song. I'm a law professor at UC Irvine, where I teach and research in the areas of criminal procedure, policing, and carceral authority, especially as they intersect with care institutions. I'm really happy to be joining all of you today to have this really important conversation. So as we've heard, the problems of mass incarceration bleed into hospital and healthcare settings through policing. And because police, jails, and prisons need you to provide medical treatment for the people they arrest, and because the big problems with medical care in jails and prisons and healthcare systems are entangled with carceral systems. Given that reality, how do we advance these abolitionist goals while we are within the systems that currently exist? In this next set of slides, Jake Sonnenberg and I are going to talk about the laws undergirding common scenarios involving patients who are under police and carceral custody. Next slide. First, I want to highlight the importance of this word custody. Now, custody is a fluid and broad term. It can refer to coercive environments where you don't feel free to leave, but are not yet formally arrested, to being under formal arrest, to being under correctional control. I've broken it down into 3 simplified categories. So one is post-arrest, but you're coming, you are not yet, but this is before you are imprisoned, before you are in jail. The law enforcement officer here is more likely to be an arresting officer like San Francisco police, sometimes the sheriff when they're in the act of arresting someone. Then there's post-arrest and post-incarceration, so they're coming from the jail or prison. This is almost always going to be the sheriff if they're coming from the jail, or CDCR correctional guards if they're coming from prisons like San Quentin. Then there is perceived custody, and there are 2 types here. This can be when police are investigating a person as a suspect, the person is not quite under formal arrest, and then yet an even other unclear area where police are accompanying or standing next to a patient, so you might perceive them to be in custody, but they actually are not. And why does this matter? This matters in terms of 4th Amendment search and seizure privacy rights. So privacy rights are further diminished the more formal the custody gets. So definitely after arrest and definitely after imprisonment. But if they are not in custody, patients' 4th Amendment privacy rights are not diminished. And then for patient rights, in terms of visiting and shackling, police and sheriff rules control. But if you're not in custody, these restrictions do not apply. So bottom line, you shouldn't just assume custody because if the patients are not, then these infringements are unlawful and unconstitutional. Now, I'm going to turn it over to Jake to go over certain common scenarios.
Thank you so much, Ji-Sun. My name is Jake Sonnenberg. I'm a 3rd-year medical student here at UCSF and have been really fortunate to work with Ji-Sun in research and advocacy in this area for several years now. For the next couple of minutes, I'm going to run through some scenarios focused on protecting patient rights in police encounters that commonly arise in the hospital within the confines of the systems that we currently face. One of the most common situations that comes up is when police officers are present in a clinical care area without a clear justification for being there. For example, many of us here have seen police standing in a patient's doorway or even in an ED resuscitation room while a patient is undergoing an evaluation or even a critical procedure. Police are often taking pictures of patients' injuries, waiting to ask questions of the medical staff or of the patient themselves, taking the patient's clothing or other belongings, oftentimes all without ever introducing themselves or stating their business in the patient's room. This kind of unrestricted access can erode patient privacy rights and put nearby patients, staff, and visitors all at risk of harm. And there are many ways this can happen, from police overhearing protected health information to risks of conflict escalation, gun violence, arrest, and psychological distress. An important point we want to leave you with today is that if the patient is not under arrest or explicitly in custody, the police do not have a right to be there, and you can always ask them to leave. When an officer is present or lingering in an area that you don't believe that they have a right to be in, we also encourage you to document what has happened in the electronic health record. You can record things like officer names, badge numbers, what they said and did, who they interacted with, any instructions they gave, and who, if anyone, you reported this incident to, as well as anything that the police took from the patient. A related situation, we can switch to the next slide. A related situation is when police want to question patients. Qualitative research has demonstrated that police questioning in the hospital, and especially in the trauma setting, can blur the lines for patients between the healthcare and the criminal legal systems, leading to an erosion of the therapeutic relationship, withholding of information from healthcare workers, and decreased trust in clinicians. Submitting to police questioning also, of course, carries significant legal risk for any person, whether they're a patient or not. And it's crucial for us as healthcare workers to remember that patients, just like any other person, always have the right to refuse to speak with law enforcement. Even a patient who is in custody, who is coming over from jail or prison, or who's a suspect of a crime, can exercise their constitutional right to remain silent at any time. And we should also remember that patients are in a particularly vulnerable position because of their illness and also because their movement is largely restricted in the hospital. So any interaction with police, even if technically voluntary, can easily feel non-consensual. In these situations, clinicians can help preserve patient rights by acting as a buffer between patients and the police, and by refusing to waive a patient's rights on their behalf without explicit informed consent ahead of time. When able, healthcare workers can also inform patients of their right to refuse to speak with the police, give them choices about how they'd like to proceed, and even facilitate contact with an attorney if that's something that a patient would like to pursue. Next slide, please. Another common scenario is police arriving to a patient's bedside and asking, or even not asking, to search or take a patient's property. It's important for hospitals and healthcare workers to understand that from a legal standpoint, police would almost always need a warrant to search a patient or their property, or to take something that belongs to them without their consent, as is true for any of us in day-to-day life. Police often get around this requirement in healthcare settings by getting property secondhand through hospitals and healthcare workers, like many of us. It's a convoluted legal situation, but the ultimate bottom line here is that under a constitutional principle known as the third party doctrine, when police receive property from a so-called third party intermediary, for instance, a hospital or a healthcare worker, rather than directly from the person that they're interested in this case, our patient, the police actually don't need a warrant and are able to circumvent that requirement. By turning patient property or information over to the police, or by conducting procedures at the request of the police, hospitals can actually end up helping to insulate the police from legal liability, giving them access that they would not otherwise have, and eroding patients' constitutional rights without their knowledge or consent. So again, we recommend to clinicians to say no to these requests as much as possible. You can always say things like, we do not consent to this search or seizure, and neither does the patient, or we're not giving you these items willingly. And the crucial final step is to always document truthfully what has happened and inform the patient and the patient's representatives if the patient authorizes you to do something like that, because these sorts of facts can become useful for patients down the road. The final scenario I'm going to talk about is that police are often also asking for information from clinicians about particular patients. They'll ask things like, what is their status? What are their injuries? Are they going to live? Who did they come here with? What were the tox screen results? And it's important to know that outside of mandated reporting requirements, which we all receive separate trainings on, you are generally not required to provide any protected health information to any third party without patient consent. And if the police want to get this information, there are avenues for them to seek that information legally through a warrant or subpoena of the patient's medical records, which proceeds through the legal system. It is generally not a clinician's job to evaluate the validity of a request for medical records at the bedside. So if the police do present you with something like a warrant or a subpoena, or say that they have or are entitled to certain information, unless you are personally named on a document, it is appropriate to refer officers to a supervisor or other authority that is more equipped to evaluate and respond to a formal request like that. Someone like the administrator on duty, risk management, or the medical records department. And with that, I will hand things back over to Jisun to cover a few more scenarios.
Great, thank you, Jake. So in addition to police use of healthcare spaces for police investigation and surveillance, the jail and prison follows patients into the hospital through carceral markers like shackles and guards. And we're going to talk about two forms of carceral control here: access restrictions and handcuffs. I want to frame our next discussions, though, in this way. So these requirements regarding restricted visitor access and handcuffs come from laws governing correctional and law enforcement agencies and authorities. These are typically contrary to health laws and regulations as they apply to non-custodial patients, and health laws and regulations are largely silent about this contradiction. Now, this isn't good in one way because it leads to hospital policies that prioritize law enforcement and security concerns that don't take into account patient care and best patient care practices, but the silence is also an opportunity. Where in your expertise as a medical provider, when you see that the correctional rules hurt your patient, you can play an important role in making the case for why these rules should not apply to your patient at this time. Ask yourself, is this different than how I normally treat patients? Does this infringe on the needs of patients or for my ability to provide care? If your answers are yes, then you have a role here and advocate. Now, the overarching concern here is safety and security. So for visitation, you have visitation restrictions because the police and correctional authorities think that there are safety and security concerns once they go outside of prison walls. So visitation and family access is restricted as it would be at the facility, but this should not stop you from advocating for something less restrictive. justify this based upon your medical expertise and the health needs of the patient for visits or access to family or loved ones, especially because, as you know, family access can be important for figuring out medical needs, planning future care, helping with patient decision-making, and for improving and uplifting patient spirits. But what about this gray zone where you don't know if the person is actually arrested? Police may not be clear, but they are telling you can't call family because of safety reasons or gang retribution. And this can be counterproductive and also not compassionate, especially if the person is very sick or very injured. Now, if this is contrary to how you would normally act, then advocate for what you believe is right. And think about whether there are ways that can mitigate the safety and security concerns, such as supervised calls or staff making calls. Next slide. Another common scenario is the use of handcuffs and shackling. Now, these are also shaped by safety and security rationales, and their use is contrary to hospital and healthcare rules on physical restraints, where you must have constant monitoring and justification for restraints. Now, particularly when you see these handcuffs and shackles to beds, you see the carceral world in its most stark form and these visual echoes of slavery. And there are misconceptions, though, about the use of handcuffs in these healthcare settings. Misconceptions that it doesn't cause harm to the patient, that you don't have power or authority to do anything, that you'll be responsible if something happens, and that it is necessary for your safety or it is part of their punishment. But the reality is, it causes great harm to patients. Their perceptions of you as part of law enforcement and the policing apparatus, and the provider's perceptions of the patient, heightening potential bias. And remember, all sorts of people are coming in here on handcuffs. Not all the people are coming in for violent offenses. Given how vast our mass incarceration system is, people are arrested for bench warrants, for not paying fines, disorderly conduct, misdemeanors, and yet they're being indiscriminately handcuffed. And some of these people are not even punished. They still hold the presumption of innocence, and they have not yet been sentenced. And importantly, you do have some authority if grounded in reasons of medical necessity. Next slide. Now, as a point of comparison, there are other places where incarcerated people go where they are not handcuffed. Work sites. Prisoners are not handcuffed or shackled when they go off to fight wildfires for us across the state. People go to jail leave the jail all the time to go to court. And there you have laws that say law enforcement needs to justify their reasons for shackling or a person's constitutional rights are violated. Yet this happens all the time in hospital and healthcare settings. Now, in courts, you found other ways to mitigate the risks, like you have presence of guards that are nearby at enough distance so the person could be at the court, in court unshackled and have private conversations with their lawyers. So given all that, what could you do in healthcare settings about handcuffs and shackles? Now, pregnant women are the most protected here. They have specific laws where the presumption is they should not be restrained unless there's a particularized security concerns. But in all other cases, you should think about your default should be that shackles should be removed to preserve therapeutic relationships, especially when you're doing medical examinations to accurately examine the patient. And for times outside of those medical examinations, write specific orders that would mandate removal of handcuffs at other times, such as orders to ambulate. Work with law enforcement to find less restrictive security measures. And think about other ways in which safety and security concerns could be addressed. So, for example, individualized assessments, room placement, and use of soft restraints instead. Now that we've laid out the law and practice generally, I'm handing it off to Kelly Butler and Nita Bajwa to talk about how this plays out on the ground.
Thanks, Jisun. I'm Kelly Butler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a second-year resident in family medicine here at UCSF.
And I'm Nida Bajwa. I'm also a second-year co-resident of Kelly's, and I also use she, her pronouns.
So you heard about the policy, you heard about the background, and now let's put this into a real context. We should mention that these are pulled from our personal experiences, and while not verbatim, I think a lot of the emotion, energy that we'll introduce to you in this role play is going to make sense. So your patient is a 25-year-old man with sickle cell disease, complicated by frequent hospitalizations for pain crises. He presents today in a pain crisis while in sheriff's custody. You're the resident on the team. You're walking up to the patient's room for rounds, and you turn to your team to get their best help in advocating for him. So I walk into the room. Wait, why is there an officer in the room?
Well, the patient's in custody, so I guess that's where they're supposed to be.
Not exactly. Let's talk about it. Specifically, we can ask, does this patient pose an imminent threat to anyone? If the officer responds by admitting the answer is no, but he's required to stay in the room, we can quote our hospital policy, which says that for inpatient units, the quote unquote agent will sit in a chair outside of the room where visual contact can be made at all times. I think that it's especially relevant when he's in a sickle cell crisis. And we know per scientific literature that the stress associated with that officer being in the room can only worsen his condition and pain.
I didn't know that. So can I just ask him to leave?
Definitely.
And they'll just listen?
You know, in the past, I've printed out a copy of the hospital policy and literally shown it to the officer. They can't argue with it. And ultimately, they left the room for the rest of his stay. It really improved his sense of privacy and trust in his provider team. So, Scene, what did we learn from that situation? There are a couple takeaways I want to make sure that people are aware of when it comes to this scenario, the scenario of the officer in the room. First of all, keeping a patient in eye shot doesn't mean they have to be in the room. There is plenty of stress with seeing this figure of your oppression, of your incarceration in a room with you while you're just trying to get better. And there are specific protections in CSFG policy. Let me state quite clearly, the policy that we're going to offer you today is not abolitionist. It's rooted in the belief that we just have to do what we can with the system we're currently existing in. But we'll go through some of those details in a bit. So, this patient, the next slide. So, yeah, go ahead.
So we're going to go through another scenario with the same case.
This is so effed up. This patient is in a pain crisis and he's shackled to the bed. We know restricted mobility is bad for pain. How is this okay? What can I do to advocate for him?
You're right, it is super messed up. It sounds like you can't do your job and treat his pain while he's shackled. You can and you should advocate for him.
I mean, I've talked to the officers, I asked them why he's shackled and they just say he's a threat and that they cannot unshackle him. I've already asked this officer to get out of the room. I'm over it.
I think you did the right thing by asking why he's shackled. Remember that the onus is on the officers to defend why he needs to be shackled, and you asking them every day reminds them of that and reminds the patient that you're there for them. If the bedside advocacy with the officer doesn't work, we do have a line of command for this in the hospital that may be helpful. According to hospital policy, the watch commander is supposed to authorize all use of restraints on the general inpatient units. So try printing out the policy and show it to the bedside deputy. Ensure authorization was received. And if that fails, you can reach out to the watch commander yourself. He's stationed in Building 5, and he's in charge of all sheriff's deputies in the hospital.
So what if I did that and he's still shackled? Is there anything I can do in the way of harm reduction?
Yeah, great question. You can create and order interventions that will minimize the amount of time he spends in bed and the amount of time he spends shackled. Order ambulate 5 times per day. Talk to the nurses, medical students, OT, PT. There are so many people in the hospital who can and do walk with patients. Make sure that everyone knows this is part of his treatment plan and write it down explicitly in your notes. Stay on top of folks if you don't see it happening. And every time you go in there to talk to him, examine him and remove his shackles. All right, so next slide, big takeaways there. End scene. Big takeaways there is, this is a scenario I think almost everyone who works in our hospital, especially family medicine folks, have encountered. And I think it can be really hard to advocate against. And we often get to a point where we accept it. And so in this scenario, we talk through both the ideal outcome of unshackling this person who deserves to be unshackled and the harm reduction approach of, if we did everything we can, what can we still do to ensure he gets the best care possible and to show the patient that we're there for them. Remember, as Jisun said, that the custody officer is legally required to defend the necessity of shackling. And although we have hospital policies that allow the use of restraints, unfortunately, you still have larger legal protections that we can act within. Within hospital policy, you can always escalate up the chain of command. Remember that harm reduction means frequent ambulation through any and all people who can walk with patients, removal at every physical exam check, and the least restrictive forms of restraints possible. So within these two scenarios, we utilized some policies. We drew both on larger legal frameworks and policies specific to the general. I want to mention, as Kelly mentioned, that these policies are neither up to date nor abolitionist. The policies we'll briefly go over next have not been updated since at least 2016, when a ward known as the jail ward in Building 5 was shut down, leading to the increased care of patients in custody on general medical floors. Additionally, these policies are not designed to protect folks from criminalization, and they are in some cases written by carceral institutions themselves. So we can and we should do better. However, within these unjust frameworks exist some protections for patients that we're leveraging while we're in the process of abolishing criminalization.
So let's talk about those policies. If you are a member of staff, no matter where you are on this campus and you're able to log into a computer, you should be able to access the CHN. That's where they're held, under policies and procedures. There are a number that are related to the quote unquote transport or transfer of prisoners and what it means to deliver care to people who are in custody. And we want to highlight a couple of those details for you today. I should mention, we're going to talk in a much more detail at a follow-up session on the 16th, and we hope that you join us. But let's talk about some of those details now. In 6.06, there's a specific mention of who you're supposed to talk to if you're trying to escalate. It specifically says that the charge nurse will collaborate with custody officers in compliance with law enforcement requirements. So if you're trying to figure out who do I talk to, who do I report this to, your charge nurse on an inpatient service, for example, is often the right one. It also outlines what are some of the rules, regulations around visitation that GSUN offered in a general sense. There's also 16.22, the policy around who's allowed to be in the room, where, depending on the unit. We literally pulled a screenshot from that policy here. It specifically outlines just that, how we're supposed to allow members of law enforcement to move about the world when it comes to our hospital settings, and how we should and can leverage restraints authorized by a watch commander.
Next, I'll briefly go over an additional policy. It's 1.02 that is meant to reduce the harms of substance use. And I think this is really important to note because I mentioned that these policies are not ideal, but in some cases with this policy specifically, I think that a lot of us are acting even more carcerally than what the policy protects. And so if you look at this policy, I think the important detail here is the use of the term offered. If there's concern for patient safety, you can offer a patient a property search. If the patient is altered, you can offer them a toxicology test, but they can refuse. They are legally allowed within our own hospital policy framework to refuse. If substances are found, they can be offered those substances to be locked away or given up for destruction. And notably, it is mentioned not to call the sheriffs unless the risk to life is imminent. If in the next 5-10 minutes, this patient is going to die because of the substance you think they might be using, is the only reason within this policy it's mentioned to call the sheriffs. Of course, I would argue not to call them at all, but just to say that even within the policy, this protection exists, that we should not be doing it unless the risk to life is imminent. In the next slide, I'm going to just briefly go over the sheriff's restraint policy. So the sheriff's department, SFSD, has their own policy for the treatment of people in custody at our hospital. And I want to just say that our hospital historically up until 2016 actually had a jail ward in building 5 for those who are familiar on the 7th floor. Now there is still a psychiatric jail unit 7L where a watch commander is still stationed. And so we are extremely, extremely connected to the carceral system here. And we follow this policy. That to say, the policy says that all co-inmates may be secured with restraint gear, but plastic flexible gear is okay, that they should be allowed access to the restroom or to move about by changing the gear from limb to bed to limb to limb. So you put in those plastic flexible restraints orders, you put in those ambulate, 5, 6, 7 times a day orders, that's all within their framework too. There are exceptions to the use of handcuffs at all in ICU, CCU, and LND, but they can still use plastic flexible restraints there as well. And you can always call this number. You don't have to jot it down now. You'll get resources at the end of this presentation to reach the watch commander if the patient is in sheriff's custody for further advocacy. So some overall takeaways, and this is kind of combining the specific hospital policies of our hospital, the larger legal frameworks that Jisun and Jake went over. Remember to always ask if a patient's in custody and whose custody. Don't share patient information with or in earshot of officers. Advocate for limb-to-limb restraints. Get that patient up and moving as frequently as you have capacity for. Request shackle removal at every physical exam, at every interaction. Always ask the officers to leave the patient's room. Always ask the officers to defend the necessity for shackling. And if you have any questions or concerns, go higher, go to the next level. That can be the watch commander if they're in sheriff's custody. It can be the specific office supervisor. It can be the charge nurse. It can be your attending. Whatever your role is, there are lots of ways to take this to the next level if need be. I think lastly, Kelly and I touched on the fact that some of this comes from our own personal experiences and times where we've been kind of digging through the internet, finding something we can use to help somebody. And I think through those experiences, I've learned to be consistent, to be perseverative, and to take up space.
I learned that I can't wait on anybody. This is not going to be somebody else to speak up for you. You are the doctor. You need to speak up. You have the power. We talk about the power dynamics between patients and providers and wanting to flatten the hierarchy, but the reality is what you say goes, and you hold the power here, so you have to use it. Beyond that, reporting is your friend. We come to this space because we want you to be educated about what tools are at your disposal in this larger abolition discussion. Reporting is your friend. Escalate. Share the story with everyone and anyone who will listen. Tell your senior, make sure your attending knows, make sure the charge nurse is aware, and if you need to, escalate to watch commander. There is an equivalent of that structure in every single space in a clinical environment. Make sure that you're reporting. This information should not exist in isolation.
Absolutely. Thank you all for listening. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Norman, who's going to talk about next steps, give you resources, and stay tuned.
Thank you so much, Kelly and Nida. I'm going to quickly go through some resources, and these will be sent out to all of you in a tiny URL so that you can access all the resource slides to get the readings and information that I'm about to discuss. I would also encourage everyone to use the Q&A to put any questions they have, because we will be able to get to those at the end. So first things first, if you want to practice these Know Your Rights materials and skills that you learned today, not this coming Wednesday, but the next, we are going to have a training where we'll be going through different scenarios. That's going to be led by Kelly Butler, and we're really excited. So come join us and practice these skills. Next, if you're interested in learning more about de-escalation techniques, I would encourage you to contact the Behavioral Emergency Response Team, or the BERT team. This is a team of highly trained psych techs and psych nurses who are available to be called at San Francisco General Hospital for de-escalation events. They are rapidly expanding this program and offering training. So I would encourage you to reach out to these two folks to learn more about BERT and how to contact them and learn more about de-escalation. Thirdly, we designed and launched a badge buddy, which I have an example of here. If you can see, it is a little kind of short thing that goes on your badge, and it has the ABCs of navigating police at SFDPH. It kind of just quickly goes through some of the main points we talked about today, has some resources and numbers, and it also has a QR code which links out to a bunch of resources that we have developed and are continuing to develop around abolition and patients' rights, et cetera. And you can access that. We're going to be having them at the San Francisco General Library. And you can also hit up Kelly and Nida, who are in the hospital a bunch as residents, who will have a bunch of those as well. So please pick one of those up. And then, just more resources. We want you to learn more about our campaign, some of the work we're doing. You can also access things through this QR code. And we've linked a bunch of other organizations, toolkits, networks, and just things that are really a great place to start if you're trying to learn more about abolition and interrupting criminalization. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ana Delgado to close us out, and then we'll take questions. So back to you, Ana.
Thank you so much, Norman. So as I mentioned earlier, there are many courageous organizers in the abolition community, and one group that we've connected to pretty concretely that I mentioned earlier is Interrupting Criminalization. And just last night, they released the Beyond Do No Harm principles, and this launch party was both sobering and inspiring. And I strongly, strongly encourage you all to check it out. You can go to the website and sign on as a supporter and be connected to people in your area working on these issues. The full report is available and it's very, very instructive. And like I said earlier, this is where I learned that most people who were reported to law enforcement for self-managing their abortion were reported by their healthcare providers. So really, really be thinking about how we all are on a daily basis, potentially contributing to the criminalization of our patients. And finally, before we go to Q&A, I want to extend another invitation to reflect. We have presented some concrete strategies for reducing harm to our patients and community members using the current tools and systems we have. But I call on you to go even further. As Norman said in his introduction, 100 or even 50 years before chattel slavery was abolished, people had difficulty imagining a world without it. No one had a step-by-step guide or a plan. How many examples are there in healthcare where we abolished practices such as twilight sleep and the universal forceps for childbirth, or punitive use of electroshock therapy in psychiatry? Those were commonplace. Did we have the exact roadmap? No. Did people know it was wrong and push to end the practice? Yes. And here we are today, where those practices are solidly unethical and frowned upon. So I challenge all of us, as Norman said, to imagine a world where we don't need prisons or police, where we keep each other safe, where we can be the healers that we were called to be. And with that, I would like to open it up to Q&A and invite my fellow panelists to come off or come on camera. It looks like we have a couple of questions. The first question I think would be great for Ji-sun or Jake. Do you see the question in the Q&A?
Yeah, I'll take it. So I think that this happens a lot. This kind of like, you can't do something because, and then the law enforcement will give some justification. Now, I don't know of a clear law on this, but I think that this is an example of law enforcement will say something and it's unclear to you, and it's also unclear to me whether this is actually true. In these kinds of scenarios, I think it's most, what I would do is say, okay, can you tell me what your policies are on discharge plans? Do it in a fairly like cooperative manner so that I can understand better when I'm doing discharge plans. I think that this would take away, one, this would let you know whether this actually exists. And if it does exist, if a jail or a prison has standard operating procedures, then there are ways in which you might be able to react to it better. But I think my bottom line is sometimes they might say things that are not necessarily true, but so it's important to get actual documentation that this kind of policy exists.
Thank you, Ji-sun. Our next question is, are there any advocacy or organizing opportunities that ZSFG non-clinical staff can learn more about to support this work? And I'll leave this open to anyone that wants to jump in.
So I can go ahead and take this one. Come to meet with us. We talk about this every single week. Wednesday evenings are a time where we come and share in fellowship and advocacy, in sometimes sorrow and mourning. It's our space where we can decompress. You heard from Norman that we're going to have a specific meeting next Wednesday on the 9th, where we're welcoming newcomers. It's a space where we explicitly ask that you join us. In this space is time where we are often talking about various advocacy projects around abolition and decriminalization. And we also have a couple connections with community organizations that we could certainly explore together. So we welcome you to join us next Wednesday the 9th.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next question and comment, thank you for this important presentation and for giving us some context on how we can appropriately provide care to patients in custody. Our hospital recently had an incident occur when a patient in custody was getting handcuffs removed to get treatment on the trauma floor. There was a struggle and the police officer was temporarily disabled, and the patient grabbed the officer's gun and fired shots in the department. This experience frightened staff and the officer and other patients. Because of this experience, I don't think staff would ever feel safe enough, and not sure if having the officer there was wrong or not. It's such a complex topic because all patients have rights. They should feel safe during their care, but so should hospital staff. This is a pretty complex scenario, but I'm gonna let Anna go ahead and answer this one.
So, even, as abolitionists, we still support people's safety, right? That is our, everyone needs to be safe. So we're not advocating for an approach where people are unsafe. I think we have to take the long view in situations like this. And again, recognize that the future that we're imagining is one where we don't need police in the space, where that scenario would never happen because that law enforcement officer would never be there. So I know that that's a difficult answer to address today's concern, and yet it does not stop us and should not stop us from pursuing the concrete steps forward that we outlined very clearly today to move us in the direction of a world where that scenario would be impossible. And so I think this is the complexity and the nuance of holding both of these realities at the same time, that unfortunately we are in a world where people don't have the tools and we don't have a system of transformative justice where harms and harms can be addressed and amends can be made in a different way that provides safety and actual redress for all. But this is a situation, but this is a situation that in the future we could imagine where that wouldn't happen. And more to the point, like one concrete thing to do today would be there should not be guns in hospitals. I can hardly think of a situation where that would be a good idea, particularly in situations where people are in very vulnerable positions where they may not be thinking with their logical brain. And I would say guns should just not be in the hospital. So that's one way to think about avoiding that particular situation.
Thank you, Anna. This next is a two-part question. This number one is, can you go over patient rights to phone calls when in custody? And I will let Jisun take that.
So just recently, a law was passed that now prison calls are free. So it will depend upon whether they're coming from the prison or jail. So, but for the most part, prisoners who are either in prison or people who are imprisoned in jails have rights to call their families and friends at certain given times. Now they're in a hospital and not in a jail or prison setting, so they don't have they have much more time to be able to do this. So I think that's how you should interpret it. They should be able to have phone calls because they have phone calls access when they're in jail or prison. Particularly, they have access to call their lawyers at any time. Right. So if you're in jail or prison, you can ask to call your lawyer and they have to let you call your lawyer. So keep that in mind as well. And then I'll hand it over to Nita for part two, which is any thoughts on convincing other providers who see officers as essential to safety?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a tough question. I think the question is, do you want to convince them to understand abolition and become abolitionists, or do you want to get them on the same page in protecting your patient? And I think if the goal is to be on the same page for the patient's care, then the approach that we talked about having it really explicit as part of their management plan, right, makes it just delivering them standard of care. It makes it less about the issue of how do you feel about police? Do you understand abolition as a concept? And so reinforcing that, if a patient came in with a sickle cell pain crisis, for example, who was not in custody, what would you do? Would you want them to lay in bed shackled all day? Do you agree and understand that ambulation is part of pain control, right? And that just becomes a matter of calling out someone's inequities and bias in how they're delivering care. And ultimately, I think is a lot harder to argue with than the conversation of, should police exist, should prisons exist, et cetera. And in terms of providing the best care for patients, I think that's where we can start.
I want to thank everyone for a really powerful, impactful presentation today. I really realize that this is the beginning or the middle of a conversation, but it's certainly not the end. And I want to thank you for your hard work today and encourage everybody who's interested to get involved. And I know that everyone needs to get to clinic, so I want to give again a special thank you to our presenters, and one last opportunity for someone amongst the presenters to leave us with some final words of wisdom before we close. And thank you.
I guess I'll just say that this is a movement that's going to take all of us, and we warmly, warmly welcome you to organize with us. We're a fun group. It's not all doom and gloom. We have fun too. It's a space where you will feel welcome, you will belong, and we will take care of you. This is a space where we will make this change happen. We will see the future that we are imagining.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your hard work and really just thank you for joining this effort.